May 19, 1944, 0150 hours, the Pacific Ocean, 50 mi northwest of Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton stood on the bridge of USS England, a destroyer escort displacing just 400 tons, and watched his executive officer work. The sonar operator had called contact 8 minutes earlier. A metallic ping returning from 300 ft below. Something large and metallic moved through the black water beneath them. The Japanese submarine I-16 was down there, a massive fleet submarine 350 ft long, carrying 94 men and enough fuel to patrol 20,000 mi without refueling. The I-boats were the largest submarines in the world at that time, carrying their own reconnaissance aircraft, armed with the deadly Type 95 torpedo. Each torpedo could travel 11 miles and strike with a warhead containing over 0 pounds of explosives. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from. Today, England was hunting it with a weapon most of her crew had never fired in combat. 24 small projectiles, each weighing just 24 lb, arranged in a circular pattern. The Mark 10 Hedgehog, British's American built, barely tested in Pacific waters, Pendleton had given his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, authority to conduct the attack. The younger officer had drilled the crew relentlessly during their voyage from San Francisco. Now they would learn if the training mattered. At 0226, Williamson gave the order. The Hedgehog fired with a sound like a massive cough. 24 bombs arced through the night air, splashing into the ocean ahead of the ship in a circular pattern, 60 ft across. They sank toward the contact below. Standard depth charges required a destroyer to pass directly over the target, losing sonar contact at the critical moment. The Hedgehog fired forward, allowing continuous tracking, but the charges only exploded on contact with a submarine hull. No contact meant no explosion. The crew would know immediately whether they had missed or hit. England's crew waited. 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, nothing. Then the ocean erupted. Not one explosion, but 6 distinct detonations in rapid sequence. Then a massive blast that rattled England's hull and sent a shock wave rippling across the surface. The sonar operator removed his headphones, wincing, breaking up noises, bulkheads collapsing, compressed air escaping, the sounds of a submarine dying. At 0245, debris began surfacing, large pieces of wooden planking, bits of cork insulation, Japanese papers, an officer's cap, a spreading oil slick that caught the moonlight. I-16, which had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier, was gone. 94 men into steel on the ocean floor. England had drawn first blood. But what made this moment historically significant was not that a single submarine had been sunk. American forces had sunk Japanese submarines before. What mattered was what would happen over the next 12 days, and what those 12 days would reveal about how profoundly American destroyer crews had evolved in their understanding of submarine warfare. This is the story of how that understanding developed, how American sailors learned to turn their ships directly toward incoming torpedoes, presenting the narrowest possible target, how they mastered new weapons that revolutionized anti-submarine warfare, and how a doctrine built on aggressive attack replaced the defensive posture that had cost American ships so dearly in the war's first years. It is also the story of how Japanese submarines, despite their technological superiority, failed to achieve their strategic purpose because of doctrinal blindness that no amount of engineering excellence could overcome. To understand the significance of England's hunt in May of 1944, you must first understand what Japanese submarines represented at the war's beginning and why American destroyer crews had learned to fear them. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Pacific War with what was arguably the most technologically advanced submarine fleet in the world. Not the largest, Germany possessed more submarines, but the most sophisticated in design, range, and capability. The Japanese had invested enormous resources in submarine development during the 1930s. They built submarines that could circle the globe without refueling, submarines larger than any other nation possessed. Submarines armed with the Type 95 torpedo, a weapon that used pure oxygen instead of compressed air, leaving no telltale wake and traveling at speeds American torpedoes could not match. While American submarine torpedoes had a maximum range of 9,000 YD at 46 knots, the Japanese Type 95 could reach 20,000 YD at 49 knots. The Japanese built submarines that carried aircraft, small float planes that could be assembled and launched from a watertight hangar built into the submarine's hull. Between 1932 and 1945, Japan constructed 41 submarines capable of carrying aircraft. The United States built none. Britain built none, Germany built none, Japan alone possessed this capability. Some Japanese submarines could carry 3 bombers. The I-400 class, completed in 1944, displaced 6 500 tons submerged and could launch 3 Sun attack aircraft, each carrying an 18-800 lb bomb. The size of Japanese fleet submarines dwarfed contemporary designs. The I-15 class, commissioned in 1940, displaced 2,584 tons surfaced and 654 tons submerged. They measured 358 ft in length. American Gate-class submarines, the backbone of the Pacific submarine fleet, displaced 1,525 tons surfaced and were 311 ft long. Japanese submarines carried larger crews, more fuel, more torpedoes, and heavier deck guns. The I-boats mounted 5 in naval guns. American fleet submarines carried 3 in guns. This technological superiority translated into operational capability. Japanese submarines possessed ranges that American submariners could barely imagine. The I-class boats could patrol for 100 days without returning to base. They could transit from Japan to the American West Coast, conduct operations, and return home on a single fuel load. They could reach the Indian Ocean, operate off Madagascar and South Africa, and return to Japanese waters. No other navy possessed submarines with such endurance. In the first year of the Pacific War, these capabilities produced results that shocked American naval commanders. On January 11, 1942, just 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese submarine I-6 intercepted the carrier Saratoga, 500 m southwest of Oahu. A single torpedo struck Saratoga's starboard side, flooding 3 fire rooms and killing 6 men. The carrier limped back to Pearl Harbor, then proceeded to Puget Sound for repairs. She would be out of action until June, at a moment when the Pacific Fleet possessed only 4 operational carriers. During the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, after American dive, bombers had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. The submarine I-168 penetrated the destroyer screen around the damaged carrier Yorktown. Yorktown had been struck by bombs and torpedoes during the battle. Her crew had abandoned ship, then reboarded to attempt to tow to Pearl Harbor. Destroyers surrounded the wounded carrier. I-168 submerged to 150 ft, crept beneath the screen, and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, 1 struck the destroyer Hammond, which had been tied alongside, providing power and pumps. Hammond broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. Yorktown capsized and sank the next morning. On September 15, 1942, the submarine I-19 achieved what may have been the most remarkable submarine attack of the Pacific War. Commander Kanashi Takaichi was patrolling east of Guadalcanal when he sighted the carrier Wasp and her escorts. He fired a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes from a range of 900 YD. 3 torpedoes struck Wasp, detonating aviation fuel and bomb storage. The carrier burned uncontrollably. Her crew abandoned ship. She was scuttled by destroyer torpedoes that evening, but the other 3 torpedoes from I-19 spread continued traveling through the formation. One struck the new battleship North Carolina, flooding compartments and killing 5 men. Another struck the destroyer O'Brien, blowing off her bow. O'Brien made it back to the west coast, but broke in half and sank during the return voyage. 1 submarine, 1 salvo, 6 torpedoes, 3 American warships struck. This happened while Marines were clinging to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, when the Pacific Fleet had exactly 2 operational carriers in the entire theater. Japanese submarines possessed the technology, the range, and the weapons to devastate American supply lines. They could have made the Pacific War infinitely more difficult for the United States. Yet, they did not. And understanding why reveals one of the war's great ironies. The Japanese submarine force failed to achieve strategic impact not because of technological deficiency, but because of doctrinal blindness. Japanese naval thinking traced its roots directly to the Battle of Tsushima in May of 1905. Admiral Togo Hayakairo had intercepted the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Strait and destroyed it in a single day of combat. 8 Russian battleships sunk or captured, 50 Russian sailors killed. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats, 117 men killed. Tsushima became the template for all Japanese naval planning, the decisive battle, the single climactic engagement that would determine the war's outcome. For 40 years, every aspect of Japanese naval doctrine focused on preparing for and winning this battle. Battleships were the primary weapon. Carriers provided reconnaissance and preliminary strikes. Cruisers and destroyers conducted night torpedo attacks, and submarines served as scouts and advance pickets, locating the enemy fleet, reporting its movements, and conducting attrition attacks before the main engagement. This doctrine was codified in Japanese naval regulations. The revised battle instructions of 1934 stated explicitly that battleship divisions are the main weapon in a fleet battle, and their task is to engage the main force of the enemy. Submarines existed to support this mission. They would be positioned along the anticipated route of the American advance. They would report American fleet movements. They would attack damaged ships fleeing the battle. They would whittle down American strength before the decisive engagement. What submarines would not do was hunt merchant ships. Commerce raiding was considered dishonorable. It targeted civilians rather than warriors. It avoided battle rather than seeking it. The Japanese Navy had modeled itself on the British Royal Navy, which had a long tradition of fleet actions and regarded commerce warfare as ungentlemanly. German submarine warfare in the First World War had been condemned as barbaric. Japanese naval officers wanted no association with such tactics. This doctrinal rigidity had profound consequences. In December of 1941, Japan controlled the resources of Southeast Asia, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from the Philippines. These resources had to be transported to Japan by merchant ship. The supply line stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific and through waters that American submarines increasingly dominated. Yet Japanese submarines made almost no effort to protect these convoys. Their mission was to sink American warships, not to escort Japanese merchantmen. The statistics reveal the strategic failure. During the entire Pacific War, Japanese submarines sank approximately 184 merchant ships totaling 900 gross registered tons. In the same period, American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese ships totaling 2 million tons. German U-boat operating in the more confined waters of the Atlantic sank, 2008, 140 Allied ships totaling 3 million tons. The disparity becomes even more striking when you consider relative submarine strength. At the war's beginning, Japan possessed 1 110 submarines. Germany had approximately 300, yet German submarines sank more than 15 times the tonnage that Japanese submarines achieved. The difference was not technology or crew quality, it was doctrine. German submarines hunted merchant convoys. Japanese submarines hunted warships. Hunting warships meant engaging the most difficult targets in naval warfare. Destroyers could make 35 knots and turn sharply. Cruisers had even greater speed. Carriers traveled in formations surrounded by destroyer screens equipped with sonar and depth charges. All were defended by anti-aircraft guns and could launch aircraft to hunt submarines. Attacking such targets required penetrating defensive screens, achieving favorable attack positions, and escaping afterward. Success rates were inherently low. By contrast, merchant ships were slow, predictable, and largely undefended for the first 2 years of the war. A tanker carrying fuel from the Dutch East Indies to Japan made perhaps 12 knots. It followed established shipping routes. It often sailed alone or in small groups with minimal escort. A submarine commander who encountered such a target could take time to achieve perfect firing position. Yet, Japanese submarine doctrine discouraged attacks on such vessels unless no military targets were available. The consequences extended beyond simple tonnage sunk. Japanese failure to protect their merchant marine meant that by 1944, Japan was being strangled economically. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies fell to a trickle. Factories lacked raw materials. The population faced growing food shortages. The combined fleet, which had been the most powerful naval force in the Pacific in December of 1941, had to be stationed in Singapore rather than Japanese home waters because fuel shortages made it impossible to operate from Japan. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines were being pulled from combat operations to serve as supply vessels. Submarines transported rice, ammunition, and reinforcements to isolated island garrisons that American forces had bypassed. This was perhaps the ultimate admission of strategic failure. Submarines that had been designed to sink enemy warships were reduced to hauling cargo to garrisons that would inevitably be abandoned or overwhelmed. In May of 1944, however, Japanese submarine commanders still believed they could influence the war's outcome. American forces were advancing toward the Marana Islands. The loss of the Maranas would bring Japan within range of American B-29 bombers. It would sever the supply line to the Philippines. It might trigger the decisive naval battle that Japanese doctrine had anticipated for 40 years. Admiral Simu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, ordered submarines of the 7th Submarine Squadron to establish a patrol line north of the Admiralty Islands. Their mission was to detect American carrier task forces advancing toward the Maranas and to report their movements to the combined fleet. 7 submarines would form this patrol line: I-16, Row 104, Row 105, Row 106, Row 108, Row 109, and Row 116. They would be positioned at intervals across the likely American approach routes. They would maintain radio silence except when reporting enemy contacts. They would remain on station for 30 days. The operation was codenamed NA Line for the grid coordinates where the submarines would patrol. What Japanese commanders did not know was that American codebreakers had read the orders establishing the NA Line. They knew where the submarines would be stationed. They knew when they would arrive on station. They knew their mission. And they were preparing to destroy them systematically using tactics and weapons that had been developed through 2.5 years of bitter experience in anti-submarine warfare. The American Navy that faced Japanese submarines in December of 1941 was ill-prepared for anti-submarine warfare. This was not because of technological deficiency or lack of courage. It was because American naval doctrine, like Japanese Doctrine, had focused almost entirely on surface fleet actions. Destroyers were designed to screen battleships, conduct torpedo attacks against enemy capital ships, and engage in surface gun duels. Anti-submarine warfare was a secondary mission at best. The early months of the Pacific War revealed this unpreparedness brutally. American destroyers carried depth charges, but the tactics for employing them were primitive. A destroyer detecting a submarine on sonar would race toward the contact, losing sonar contact as it passed over the target, and drop depth charges set to detonate at estimated depth. The charges were rolled off stern racks or thrown to the sides by KG gun projectors. Each charge contained 300 lb of TNT. The explosion had to occur within 20 ft of a submarine hull to cause catastrophic damage. 40 ft away, damage was moderate. 60 ft away, the submarine might not even know it had been attacked. This created a fundamental tactical problem. The destroyer lost sonar contact at precisely the moment it needed it most. The submarine commander, hearing propellers approaching, would execute emergency maneuvers. Dive deeper, turn hard left or right, reduce speed to minimize noise. By the time the depth charges exploded, the submarine had moved. The destroyer would regain sonar contact and realize the target was now hundreds of yards from the attack point. Another attack run would begin, and the submarine would evade again. Depth charge attacks were also dangerous for the attacking ship. Racing over a submarine meant passing through its torpedo-firing solution. Japanese submarines carried 20 torpedoes. They could fire spreads that made evasion difficult. American destroyer captains learned to fear the moment when they passed over a contact. That was when their ship was most vulnerable. Many destroyers were damaged or sunk while conducting depth charge attacks. The British, who had been fighting German U-boat in the Atlantic since September of 1939, had developed more sophisticated tactics. They created hunter-killer groups where multiple ships worked together. One ship maintained sonar contact while another attacked. They developed forward, throwing weapons that allowed a ship to attack without passing over the target. The most successful was the Hedgehog. Developed in 1941 and entering service in 1942, the Hedgehog was revolutionary in concept. Instead of rolling charges off the stern, it fired 24 small bombs forward in a circular pattern. Each bomb weighed 24 lb and contained 35 lb of Torpex explosive. The bombs were fired in a pattern 60 ft in diameter. They sank at approximately 23 feet per second. Crucially, they only exploded on contact with a solid object. A depth charge exploded whether it hit anything or not, creating a massive disturbance that destroyed sonar contact for several minutes. Hedgehog bombs that missed simply sank to the bottom without exploding. The attacking ship maintained sonar contact throughout the attack and knew immediately where the hits had been achieved. The Hedgehog began arriving in the Pacific in 1943. Destroyer escorts, a new class of smaller, more numerous anti-submarine vessels, were being equipped with the weapon. These ships displaced 400 tons, carried 5 guns, and were specifically designed for convoy, escort, and submarine hunting. They were slower than fleet destroyers, making only 24 knots, but they carried the latest sonar equipment and could embark larger anti-submarine warfare teams. USS England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort commissioned in December of 1943. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, was a career officer in his early 40s. He had an unusual command style. He gave his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, extraordinary authority to conduct operations. Williamson was younger, more aggressive, and obsessive about training. During England's transit from San Francisco to the combat zone, Williamson drilled the crew relentlessly on Hedgehog attacks, practice runs, emergency procedures, coordination between sonar operators, the bridge, and the Hedgehog crew. By the time England reached the Solomon Islands in March of 1944, her crew could execute a Hedgehog attack with precision that veteran anti-submarine warfare officers found remarkable, but training and weapons were only part of the equation. The critical advantage came from intelligence. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, based at Pearl Harbor, had been reading Japanese naval codes since before Midway. By 1944, American codebreakers could decrypt Japanese submarine orders within hours of transmission. They knew where Japanese submarines were ordered to patrol, they knew their schedules, they knew their routes. This intelligence allowed American forces to position hunter-killer groups exactly where Japanese submarines would be. On May 13, 1944, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted and decoded a message from the submarine I-16. The message reported I-16's estimated time of arrival at Bougainville as 2002 hours on May 22nd. This intelligence was passed to Commander Hamilton Haines, commanding Escort Division 39 at Chilagi. Haines ordered 3 destroyer escorts to intercept: USS George, USS Raby, and USS England. The ships departed Port Purvis on May 18th. If you find this story engaging, wanted PLEA SOATH, SE Darer a Taronin meant to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 3 ships formed a scouting line with intervals of 0 yards between ships. They steamed north toward the intercept point, searching with sonar. On the night of May 18th to 19th, England made contact with I-16 at the coordinates intelligence had predicted. The submarine was exactly where the codreaders said it would be. Williamson executed the attack. 6 Hedgehog bombs struck I-16. Submarine sank with all hands, 1 attack, 1 kill. The crew of England had no way of knowing this was merely the beginning. After sinking I-16, the 3 destroyer escorts continued north. Intelligence indicated more submarines on the NA line. On May 20th, radar on USS George detected a surfaced submarine at 0350 hours. The submarine dived when illuminated by searchlight. George attacked with Hedgehogs at 0415 but missed. England regained contact at 0425 and prepared to attack. Commander Haines aboard, George wanted his ship to get credit for the kill. He ordered England to stand clear while George conducted additional attacks. For the next 20 hours, George and Raby made repeated Hedgehog attacks against the submarine, now identified as Row 106. Every attack missed. The submarine was conducting evasive maneuvers, probably commanded by a skilled captain who had survived previous depth charge attacks. At 0501 on May 22nd, after more than 20 unsuccessful attacks by the other ships, Hans finally ordered England to attack. Williamson fired 1 salvo, at least 3 Hedgehog bombs detonated, a massive underwater explosion followed. Heavy oil and debris surfaced. Row 106 was destroyed, 56 men dead. The hunter-killer group formed a new search line and continued north. At 0120 on May 23rd, George detected Row 104 on radar. England made sonar contact and attacked at 0154. Multiple detonations breaking up noises, oil, and debris. Row 104 sank with all hands, 3 submarines in 4 days. England's crew was beginning to realize they were part of something unprecedented. On May 24th at 0350, the 3 ships detected another submarine. This was Row 108. England attacked at 0405. The first Hedgehog salvo missed. England came around for a second attack at 0421. Multiple hits. The submarine broke apart underwater. The explosions were so violent that men on England's deck were knocked down by the concussion. Debris and oil covered the surface for miles, 4 submarines in 5 days. Admiral William Hooley, commanding 3rd Fleet, sent a message to England. "May we borrow you for the opening of the Tokyo season?" The joke concealed growing concern. American intelligence knew 7 submarines had been positioned on the NA line. England and her companions had sunk 4. Where were the other 3? More importantly, had the Japanese realized their submarine picket line was being systematically destroyed? On May 26th, a hunter-killer group consisting of the escort carrier Hogat Bay and 4 destroyers arrived to relieve the destroyer escorts for refueling, but intelligence indicated 2 more submarines remained in the area, Row 105 and Row 116. England, George and Raw were ordered to continue the hunt. They refueled at sea from a tanker and resumed patrol. At 0120 on May 26th, George detected Row 116 on radar. England made sonar contact at 0150 and fired Hedgehogs at 0214, 3 to 5 detonations. Unlike previous attacks, there was no massive secondary explosion, but oil and debris appeared after sunrise. The oil slick eventually covered several square miles. On June 25, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy declared Row 116 lost with all hands. 5 submarines in 7 days. Now only 1 submarine remained, Row 105. Intelligence placed it northwest of the Admiralty Islands. The hunter-killer group searched for days without contact. Row 105 was either not where intelligence predicted, or its commander had realized something was destroying the picket line and had gone silent. The search continued through May 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. No contact. Then on May 30th, sonar operators on England picked up a faint contact. Very faint, possibly a submarine running silent at minimal speed, trying to remain undetected. Commander Haynes was aboard George. He ordered George to attack first. George made multiple Hedgehog attacks, all missed. The submarine was evading skillfully. After 25 hours of failed attacks with over 20 Hedgehog salvos expended, Haynes sent a message to England that would become famous in naval history. "Okay, England, it's your turn." At 0736 on May 31st, England fired her Hedgehog. At least 10 bombs exploded 180 ft below the surface. 5 minutes later, a massive underwater explosion shook the ocean. Oil, debris, and human remains surfaced. Row 105 was destroyed, 55 men dead. England had sunk 6 submarines in 12 days. No ship in naval history had achieved such a record. The entire Japanese submarine picket line had been annihilated. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, sent a message to England's crew. "There'll always be an England in the United States Navy." The destroyer Escort had achieved what military historians would later recognize as the most successful anti-submarine patrol in naval history. But the significance extended beyond simple numbers. The destruction of the NA line demonstrated that American forces had mastered anti-submarine warfare to a degree that made Japanese submarine operations suicidal. The annihilation of the NA line submarine picket in May of 1944 represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated the complete failure of Japanese submarine doctrine and the evolution of American anti-submarine warfare into a systematic scientific form of naval combat. Every advantage the Japanese had possessed in December of 1941 had been neutralized or turned against them. Japanese submarines had superior range and endurance. This became a liability when American codebreakers could predict their patrol areas and position hunter-killer groups to intercept them. Long patrol durations meant Japanese submarines spent weeks on station, giving American forces ample opportunity to locate and destroy them. The very characteristics that made Japanese submarines excellent scouts for fleet actions made them vulnerable to systematic hunting. Japanese submarines had superior torpedoes. This mattered little when the submarines never got within firing range. The Hedgehog allowed American ships to attack from 200 yards away, maintaining sonar contact throughout the engagement. Japanese submarine commanders trained to evade depth charges found that evasive maneuvers were useless against a weapon that fired a pattern of projectiles forward. There was no point where the attacking ship lost contact, no opportunity to turn and dive away from the attack point. Japanese submarine commanders were skilled and experienced. Many had served in submarines since the 1930s. They knew how to evade depth charges, how to conduct silent running, how to exploit thermal layers that confused sonar. But this experience became worthless when American intelligence knew exactly where they would be. Skill cannot overcome being ambushed at coordinates provided by codering. Experience cannot save you when the enemy knows your orders before you receive them. The human cost was staggering. 6 submarines destroyed, over 350 Japanese submariners killed. These were not conscripts or hastily trained recruits. They were career sailors, some with decades of service. They died because their Navy's doctrine placed them in positions where American technological and intelligence advantages could be applied systematically. They died because their commanders refused to abandon a conception of submarine warfare that had been obsolete since 1942. After the destruction of the NA line, Japanese submarine operations in the Central Pacific effectively ceased. Submarines continued to operate, but they avoided areas where American hunter-killer groups patrolled. They transported supplies to isolated garrisons. They conducted occasional reconnaissance missions, but the dream of using submarines to locate and weaken American carrier task forces before the decisive battle was dead. American carrier task forces operated with near impunity. When Japanese search planes or submarines did locate American forces, they often discovered that American ships already knew Japanese positions and were maneuvering to intercept Japanese responses. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 illustrated the new reality. Admiral Ozawa brought 9 carriers and supporting vessels to destroy American forces invading Saipan. American submarines detected the Japanese fleet before it could launch strikes. Submarines sank 2 carriers, including Ozawa's flagship Tehaho. American carrier aircraft destroyed more than 400 Japanese planes in what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese submarines played no meaningful role in the battle. They could not locate American forces in time to provide useful intelligence. They could not penetrate the destroyer screens to attack American carriers. They had become irrelevant to the naval war. By late 1944, Japanese submarines were being used primarily as cargo vessels. The submarine I-365 transported supplies to bypassed garrisons in the Marshall Islands. The submarine I-36 carried aviation fuel to Tiar Ruk. These were missions that destroyer escorts or cargo submarines should have performed. Using fleet submarines as supply vessels represented the ultimate admission of doctrinal failure. Submarines designed to sink enemy warships in support of the decisive battle were hauling rice and ammunition to garrisons that would be starved into surrender. The contrast with American submarine operations was stark. American submarines conducted unrestricted warfare against Japanese merchant shipping. They sank tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. They torpedoed transports carrying troops to defend island garrisons. They intercepted convoys bringing raw materials to Japanese factories. By the end of 1944, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to less than half its December 1941 tonnage. Factories shut down for lack of raw materials. The population faced food rationing that approached starvation levels. The combined fleet could not sortie from Japanese bases because fuel oil was unavailable. American submarines achieved this strategic impact while losing 42 boats to enemy action in the Pacific. Japanese submarines lost 130 boats while achieving minimal strategic impact. The difference was not technology or courage. It was doctrine. American submarines hunted merchant ships. Japanese submarines hunted warships. American submarines strangled Japan's economy. Japanese submarines achieved tactical successes that did not affect the war's outcome. Consider the broader implications. Japan possessed the industrial capacity to build sophisticated submarines. Japanese engineers designed vessels that exceeded American submarines in range, size, and capability. Japanese submariners trained intensively and demonstrated courage repeatedly. Yet, the Japanese submarine force contributed almost nothing to Japan's war effort. Meanwhile, American submarines operating under doctrine that emphasized commerce warfare strangled Japan's economy and contributed decisively to Allied victory. The difference was not resources or courage or technology. It was strategic vision. The lesson applies beyond submarine warfare. Military forces can possess superior equipment, better training, and greater courage, yet still fail if their doctrine misunderstands how to employ these advantages. The German army in World War, Roman II possessed tanks that were technically superior to most Allied tanks. Yet, Germany lost the war because Allied forces produced more tanks, employed them more effectively, and integrated them into combined arms operations that German doctrine could not counter. Japanese pilots at the war's beginning were more experienced than American pilots. Yet, Japan lost the air war because America trained more pilots, developed better tactics, and built more aircraft than Japan could match. England's story illustrates this principle at the tactical level. A relatively small, lightly armed destroyer Escort destroyed 6 submarines because she possessed better intelligence, better weapons, and better tactical doctrine than her opponents. The submarines she destroyed were larger, faster, and more heavily armed. Their technological superiority irrelevant. They fought according to doctrine that exposed them to systematic destruction. England fought according to doctrine that exploited every advantage available. The outcome was inevitable once the engagement began. The men who served aboard England understood they had participated in something extraordinary. Lieutenant Williamson, the executive officer who orchestrated the attacks, later reflected that the crew's confidence grew with each success. After destroying I-16, they believed they could sink any submarine they encountered. After destroying Roe 106, they knew they were the most effective anti-submarine vessel in the Pacific. After destroying 6 submarines, they understood they had achieved something that would be remembered as long as naval warfare was studied. That confidence came not from arrogance, but from competence earned through training, applied through skill, and validated through results. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton's unusual command style contributed to this success. He allowed Williamson to conduct attacks with minimal interference. He trusted his crew's expertise. He created an environment where initiative was rewarded and training was prioritized. This leadership approach contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy common in many naval vessels. Pendleton understood that anti-submarine warfare required quick decisions based on technical expertise. Officers needed authority to act without waiting for orders. England's success vindicated this approach. When England was struck by a kamikaze off Okinawa in May of 1945, killing 37 men, the crew fought the fires and saved their ship. The same competence that had destroyed 6 submarines in 12 days now saved England from sinking. The ship survived damaged but afloat. Testimony to her crew's skill and determination, that she was never repaired, that she was sold for scrap 17 months after her greatest triumph does not diminish what she accomplished. England's 12 days in May of 1944 demonstrated principles of naval warfare that remain valid today. Admiral King's promise that there would always be an England in the United States Navy honored those 12 days. From 1963 to 1994, the guided missile cruiser USS England carried the name. That ship served with distinction through the Cold War, representing values her namesake had embodied: technical proficiency, tactical excellence, and unwavering determination. When that England was decommissioned, the name passed from active service. Perhaps someday another England will join the fleet. The name deserves to be remembered. The Japanese submariners who died on the NA line deserve remembrance as well. They served their country with loyalty and courage. They executed missions they believed would contribute to victory. That their doctrine was flawed was not their fault. They died because their leadership failed to understand how submarine warfare had evolved and refused to adapt when evidence of failure became overwhelming. Their sacrifice achieved nothing strategically, but their courage and professionalism merit respect. War kills skilled and courageous men on both sides. Doctrine determines which side sacrifices advance strategic objectives, and which side sacrifices merely add to the casualty lists. At 0150 hours on May 19, 1944, when England's sonar operator first detected I-16, two futures became possible. In one future, I-16 evaded the attack, completed her patrol, and reported when American carrier task forces approached the Marianas. The decisive battle occurred with Japanese submarines, providing tactical intelligence that improved Japanese prospects marginally. In the other future, England destroyed I-16 in minutes, then systematically annihilated the entire submarine picket line, demonstrating that American anti-submarine warfare had evolved beyond anything Japanese doctrine could counter. The second future occurred. England fired her Hedgehog at 0226. 6 bombs struck I-16. The submarine exploded and sank. 94 men died, and in that moment, the last possibility that Japanese submarines could influence the Pacific War's outcome died with them. What followed over the next 12 days merely confirmed what that first attack had established. American destroyer crews had learned to hunt submarines with lethal efficiency. Japanese submarines, for all their technical sophistication, had become prey rather than predators. The balance had shifted irrevocably. That shift determined more than submarine warfare's course. It affected every subsequent operation in the Pacific. American forces advanced without fear of submarine attack. Amphibious invasions proceeded without submarine interference. Supply lines operated securely. The freedom of action this provided accelerated American operations and reduced casualties in other domains. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines, unable to operate effectively, withdrew to secondary missions or were destroyed attempting to fulfill missions they could not accomplish. By the war's end, the Japanese submarine force that had begun the conflict as one of the world's most advanced had been reduced to near irrelevance. The story of USS England and her 12 days in May of 1944 is not a story of American technological superiority. It is a story of how doctrine, intelligence, and training can overcome technological disadvantage. It is a story of how systematic learning from combat experience produces tactical excellence that no amount of courage can overcome. It is a story of how war punishes strategic rigidity and rewards adaptive innovation. And it is a story that reminds us that the outcome of conflicts is determined not by the specifications of equipment or the courage of warriors, but by the wisdom of the doctrine that guides how equipment and warriors are employed. 12 days, 6 submarines, 350 men dead, 1 destroyer Escort that proved doctrine matters more than technology. Intelligence matters more than courage, and systematic application of lessons learned matters more than initial advantages. That is England's legacy. That is the lesson written in blood in the Pacific Ocean in May of 1944. And that lesson remains valid wherever military forces confront the eternal question of how to employ violence effectively in service of strategic objectives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now.